I was 16 years old when I went to summer camp with my school. It was the first time I had ever done something like that, and the idea of spending a week in the middle of the forest, far from my parents, sounded amazing. The camp was in a very isolated area, surrounded by mountains and dense trees. The place had everything a teenager could want: trails, lakes, outdoor activities, and nights around the campfire. On the second day, a group of friends and I decided to venture beyond the marked trails. We wanted to explore a part of the forest that, according to some counselors, was off-limits. Of course, to us, that only made the idea more appealing. We wanted to see something that no one else at camp would have the chance to see. We walked for about an hour, laughing, joking, and enjoying the freedom of being in the middle of nature when we came across something unexpected. An old cabin hidden among the trees. It was a small, clearly very old wooden structure, almost blending in with the surrounding vegetation. The windows were broken, and the door hung from a rusty hinge. My first reaction was curiosity. I loved stories about abandoned places, and that cabin seemed straight out of one of those legends you hear around a campfire. Some of my friends suggested we should go back, but of course most of them wanted to go inside. Something inside me told me it wasn't a good idea, but as always, peer pressure won out. So we went in. The smell inside the cabin was the first thing that made me uncomfortable. It smelled of mold, mixed with something metallic and bitter, like rusty iron. The floorboards creaked under our feet, and the air inside was heavy, dense. Sunlight barely filtered through the broken windows, so we used our phone flashlights to light up the space. The cabin seemed to have been abandoned for a long time. There were old pieces of furniture, a table in the center, and a rocking chair in one corner, covered in dust. Everything was very deteriorated, as if it had been hastily left behind and forgotten for decades. My friends started rummaging through the corners, laughing, as if it were a fun adventure, but I felt uncomfortable. Something about that place was wrong. While they were messing with things, I approached the rocking chair in the corner of the room. It seemed strangely out of place, as if it were the only thing that was still in use. It looked like, at any moment, someone would sit in it. I bent down to take a closer look, and that's when I noticed something that made my heart race. The chair was moving slightly, rocking back and forth very slowly, almost imperceptibly. There was no wind. No one was near it, but the chair rocked. I tried to get my friend's attention, but before I could say anything, I heard a low sound. A whisper came from inside the cabin. A faint whisper, as if someone were speaking very close to my ear, but without forming words. The sound seemed to surround the place, growing louder every second. My friends continued laughing, fiddling with things, unaware of what was happening. The whisper became more intense, and I felt a wave of panic wash over me. It was as if the walls were closing in on me, and that sound, it seemed to come from all directions. I couldn't take it anymore. Without thinking, I ran out the cabin door, leaving my friends behind. Outside, the air was fresh, but I was still shaking. Minutes later, my friends came out, laughing, not understanding why I had fled. I tried to explain what I had heard, but they didn't believe me. They said it was all in my head, that I was just scared of being in an old, dark place. But I knew it wasn't just that. As we walked back to camp, I couldn't stop thinking about the sound of that rocking chair and the whisper that seemed to surround me. The whole way back, I felt like we were being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder every few steps, but I didn't see anyone. My friends continued making jokes about the cabin, but for me, Something about that experience was deeply wrong. That night, while we were all gathered around the campfire, I tried to forget what had happened, but the feeling of discomfort didn't go away. I felt like I was being watched, as if the forest around us was hiding something we had awakened by entering the cabin. When I finally went to my tent, the fear came back in full force. Every sound of the forest, the rustling of leaves, the snapping of branches, made me jump. I woke up in the middle of the night with a feeling of dread. I didn't know why, but something made me look out through the tent opening. And that's when I saw it. Standing there a few meters away, at the edge of the clearing where we were camping, was a figure. Tall, thin, motionless. I couldn't make out the face, but I knew it was watching me. I zipped the tent up as quickly as I could and lay there, trembling until dawn. The next day, when I told my friends what I had seen, they said I must have been dreaming, that it was just the result of being scared by the cabin. I never found out what really happened in that cabin, but something inside me changed after that day. Every time I think about it, I still feel that chill. I still hear the whisper, and sometimes I get the feeling that the figure is still around, watching me from a distance, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself again. Camping had always been something my friends and I loved doing. The feeling of being far from civilization, surrounded by nature, with the freedom to do whatever we wanted, was one of our favorite ways to spend the weekend. So, when we decided to camp in a fairly isolated national forest, I didn't think twice. It would be another one of those peaceful nights around a campfire, telling stories and laughing until late. The place we chose was incredible. It was a few hours' drive from the city, and after parking, we had to walk for about 40 minutes to reach the perfect spot we had found in our online research. It was a clearing surrounded by tall trees, with a spectacular view of the stars. There was no one around. We were completely alone, which only made it more exciting. We arrived around late afternoon, set up the tents, and prepared the area for what would be a fun night. As soon as the sun began to set, we lit a campfire. It quickly illuminated the area, and as the heat from the flames pushed away the night's growing chill, we sat around, drinking beers and sharing stories about the last few weeks. Everything was going great until that point. The sky was clear, with no clouds, and the silence of the forest was only broken by the soft sound of the wind rustling through the leaves. It was the perfect peace we always sought when we went camping. After a few hours, it was getting late, and we decided it was time to put out the fire and head to bed. That's when things started to get strange. We grabbed the water bottle and poured it over the flames, expecting the fire to go out, as it always did. But this time, something wasn't right. Instead of the flames dying down as usual, they seemed to grow stronger. I stood there, staring at it, trying to understand what was happening. Had we not used enough water? So we poured more water, but even then, the flames kept burning, as if they were being fed by something we couldn't see. The fire simply wouldn't go out. My friends started noticing that something was wrong too. We tried pouring more water, even covering the fire with dirt, but nothing worked. With every attempt, the fire seemed to react strangely, almost as if it had a life of its own. The sound of the burning would grow more intense, and it was almost as if the fire was whispering something, a low and disturbing sound that seemed to blend with the wind. The sound grew louder, almost like a murmur, and I started feeling a chill down my spine. We stood there in silence, watching the flames. Something about it didn't make sense. The air was still, with no wind, but the fire seemed to grow. None of us knew what to do. It was just a campfire, And yet, there was something deeply wrong with it that night. Then, without warning, the fire began to crackle in a different, more aggressive way. The flames, which should have been dying down, suddenly surged as if they had been reignited by something invisible. I stepped back, my heart racing. Fear began to take hold of me, and I could see my friends were uneasy too, staring at the fire that simply refused to die. At some point, one of my friends suggested we leave the fire alone and go to sleep. What else could we do? If it didn't want to go out, then let it burn until it was done. But I couldn't take my eyes off the flames. There was something hypnotic about them, something telling me that staying near that fire wasn't safe. It was as if the fire itself was alive. Despite the growing fear, we eventually went back to our tents, but no one really slept that night. The sound of the crackling fire never stopped, and every now and then, I opened my eyes, waiting for it to finally go out. But it kept burning with no signs of stopping. Around 3 a.m., something even more disturbing happened. I was lying in my tent, trying to calm down, when I heard a louder sound coming from the fire. It was like a sharp crack, as if something heavy had been thrown into the flames. I slowly got out of my tent and saw my friends doing the same, all of us staring at the fire with expressions of panic. The fire was still there, but now it seemed bigger, and the sound of whispers had returned, louder than before. Suddenly, without any explanation, the flames began to die down. The fire, which had seemed indestructible, started to fade little by little until only glowing embers remained in the middle of the darkness. The silence that followed was almost deafening. We all stood there, staring at the embers, trying to understand what had just happened. The next morning, when the sun finally started to rise over the horizon, the fire was completely out. No smoke, no sign of the flames that had terrified us so much. Just cold ashes, as if the previous night had been nothing but a nightmare. But we knew it was real. We never talked much about what happened that night. Each of us returned home with the sense that something unusual, something beyond our understanding, had occurred. That campfire that wouldn't go out, the sound that seemed to murmur within the flames, and the feeling of being watched by something we couldn't see. After that, we never camped at that place again. And since that night, whenever we light a fire, we all stay on edge, watching the flames with suspicion. Because deep down, there's always that fear that, at some point, the fire won't go out again. I have always been a nature lover. Since I was a child, my father would take me on hikes and camping trips, and those experiences made me develop a taste for adventures in remote places. So, when my friends suggested a hike to an isolated mountain and camping there, I agreed right away. It would be a weekend of complete disconnection. No phones, no city, just us and the vast wilderness around us. The plan was simple. Climb the mountain on the first day, set up camp near the top, and spend the night there, enjoying the view of the stars and the peace of isolation. There were 5 of us. Me, Daniel, Lucas, Mateus, and Felipe. They all had camping experience, so I felt confident in having a team that knew what they were doing. The climb was tiring, but the place was beautiful. The dense forest would open up at times, revealing breathtaking views. The tall trees blocked the sun in some areas, casting long, mysterious shadows along the path. But for me, that was part of the adventure's charm. We arrived at the campsite in the late afternoon. It was a small clearing at the top of the mountain, with an incredible view of distant mountains and a sky that was already beginning to change colors as the sun set. We quickly set up the tents and lit a campfire to warm ourselves, as the cold was starting to set in. Night fell and everything was going well. We sat around the fire, roasting marshmallows, talking about life and laughing about old stories. The temperature had dropped significantly, and the silence was almost absolute, broken only by the sound of the wind in the leaves and the crackling of the fire. That's when we heard the first scream. It was a sound that made my body freeze instantly, something between a cry and a scream of despair. At first, no one said anything. We just looked at each other, as if trying to confirm that we had all heard the same thing. The scream seemed to come from far away, echoing through the mountains, but it was clearly human. It sounded like someone calling for help, but at the same time, there was something deeply unsettling about it. Felipe was the first to break the silence. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice full of tension. We all nodded, nervous. We tried to rationalize what it was. Maybe it was some animal, though I had never heard anything like that before. Maybe someone was lost in the mountain, but who would be there at that hour? We were far from any civilization, and we knew there was no one else around. After a few minutes of silence, the sound came again, louder this time. It was the same scream as before, but now it seemed closer. Each one of us tensed up. There was no ignoring that sound. Something or someone was out there, and it seemed to be getting closer. Daniel suggested we should investigate, but I knew that wasn't a good idea. Something inside me was screaming to stay close to the fire, not to stray from the camp. But Mateus and Felipe insisted. They grabbed their flashlights and started walking away, while I, Lucas, and Daniel stayed near the fire, anxious. As they walked further away, the scream echoed once again, now even louder. The tension in the air was palpable, and I could feel my heart racing. The sound had a strange quality to it, as if it were moving around us, as if it didn't come from a fixed point but from all directions. It was as if something was circling our camp, watching us from a distance. Then suddenly the scream stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. There was no more wind, no sound of animals, just the oppressive silence of the mountain. Daniel stood next to me, holding a rock as if it would offer some kind of protection. I knew he was just as scared as I was. Mateus and Felipe came running back, their faces pale. "There's nothing there," Mateus said, out of breath. "We didn't see anyone, but the sound. The sound was right behind us." Felipe nodded, still catching his breath. It's like the sound was moving. Every time we pointed the flashlight in the direction it came from, it changed positions. By this point, none of us felt comfortable there anymore. The original plan of spending a peaceful night under the stars had turned into a terrifying watch. Each of us stayed alert, listening for any sound that might indicate the scream would return. But it didn't. The night was long and disturbing. No one managed to sleep. Every crack of a branch, every movement in the surrounding forest kept us on edge. I felt like something was watching us, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to make its move. When the sun finally began to rise on the horizon, we felt an almost immediate sense of relief. The daylight dissipated some of the fear, and we quickly began packing up the camp. No one wanted to talk about what had happened. We knew something wasn't right with that mountain, but none of us wanted to admit it. We descended the mountain as fast as we could, and when we finally reached the car, the feeling of safety returned, though what we had experienced was still fresh in our minds. To this day, none of us have been able to explain what it was. A human scream, coming from all directions, as if it were surrounding us, toying with us. And even now, many years later, every time I hear a distant sound in an isolated place, I remember that night on the mountain and the fear I felt. Something on that mountain didn't want us there. And even without knowing exactly what it was, I'm sure it was better that we left.